My name is Matthew. Welcome to Dark Ascent, and today we're looking at dumb Karens trying to climb mountains. From a pharmaceutical executive who managed her Everest summit attempt between conference calls and ignored every warning that her body was giving her, to a woman who paid premium prices to stand on top of the world, then spent her final minutes complaining about the view. It was May 15th, 2014. The summit window on Mount Everest had opened. At Camp 2, at 21,000 feet, climbers prepared for summit pushes. Among them was a woman whose confidence would prove catastrophically misplaced. Darcy Sutherland was 41 from Boulder, Colorado. She'd climbed all 58 of Colorado's 14,000-foot peaks and completed mountaineering courses. By Colorado standards, she was experienced. However, Colorado's highest peak tops, out at 14,440 feet, where air contains 60% of sea-level oxygen. Everest's summit has only 33%. She'd chosen a cheaper expedition company, reasoning she didn't need hand-holding. She'd been vocal during the trek, telling others that most Everest clients were tourists with no business on a serious mountain. Most significantly, Darcy decided she would not use supplemental oxygen, considering this the only legitimate way to summit. Her guide strongly advised against it, explaining fewer than 200 people had summited without oxygen, all elite mountaineers. Darcy dismissed this. During acclimatization, Darcy's confidence seemed justified. She moved quickly, often outpacing others. Her oxygen saturation stayed in the low 70s at Camp 2. She unclipped from fixed ropes on sections she deemed easy. Her guide repeatedly told her to stay clipped in. Darcy argued she'd been climbing 15 years. On May 15th, Darcy's team moved to Camp 3 at 23,500 feet. Her oxygen saturation was 68%, good, especially without supplemental oxygen. That evening, the guide emphasized everyone would use oxygen from Camp 4 onward, non-negotiable. After 30 minutes of argument, Darcy reluctantly agreed to carry oxygen, but made clear she intended to summit without it if possible. The team moved to Camp 4 on May 17th. Darcy struggled more than expected, arriving noticeably fatigued. Her oxygen saturation was 62%. The summit push began at 9 p.m. Darcy started with oxygen at 2 liters per minute. At 27,000 feet, she removed her mask. The guide told her to put it back on. Darcy ignored him. Her pace slowed noticeably. Her movements became less coordinated. At the balcony at 27,500 feet, the guide checked her equipment. She turned off the flow valve. He turned it back on and stated if she turned it off again, he would end her summit attempt immediately. At 28,000 feet as dawn broke, Darcy's coordination became impaired. She stumbled on flat ground. The guide recognized cerebral hypoxia and increased her oxygen flow. They reached the south summit at 28,700 feet around 6:30 a.m. Darcy sat heavily. Her response was slow, words slurred. The guide performed a coordination test. Darcy missed his finger twice. Clear signs of high-altitude cerebral edema, HACE. The guide told Darcy they needed to descend immediately. Darcy refused. The guide radioed base camp. They advised immediate descent. Darcy stood and walked toward the summit, not down. The guide grabbed her arm. Darcy pulled away. At 28,700 feet, he barely had strength to move himself, let alone restrain a client. He followed, hoping to convince her to turn around. Darcy continued at extremely slow pace. Other climbers passed. Several asked if everything was okay. The guide said his client showed cerebral edema signs but refused to descend. At 7:30 a.m., Darcy reached the traverse below the Hillary step. Her movements were uncoordinated. Halfway across, she stopped, swaying. The guide grabbed her harness. Her eyes were unfocused. She didn't seem to recognize him. The guide turned her around and clipped her facing downward. Darcy didn't respond but moved when pushed. After approximately 100 feet, her legs buckled. She couldn't support her weight. Her consciousness was declining rapidly. The guide radioed for emergency assistance. He tried dragging her, but moving an incapacitated person at that altitude was nearly impossible. Over 30 minutes, Darcy deteriorated. She became unresponsive. Her breathing became irregular. At 8:15 a.m., she lost consciousness. The guide checked for a pulse, weak and rapid. He tried dragging her toward the south summit, but managed only 50 feet over 20 minutes, exhausting himself to the point of risking his own life. At 8:45 a.m., Darcy stopped breathing. Rescue breathing at 28,600 feet was ineffective. He checked for a pulse. None. Darcy Sutherland was dead. The guide radioed that his client had died. He was instructed to descend immediately. He moved her body slightly off the main route and descended. Days later, a team attempted to move her body but found it frozen in place. Official cause of death was high-altitude cerebral edema, with contributing factors of inadequate supplemental oxygen use, continued ascent despite symptoms, and refusal to descend when advised. The guide's radio logs documented his repeated warnings and Darcy's refusals. Darcy Sutherland's body remains on Everest at approximately 28,550 feet, visible to climbers who pass that section. It was June 3, 2018, on the upper roots of Mount Everest, where morning sunlight began warming frost-covered granite slopes. The previous night's freeze-thaw cycle had loosened unstable rock fragments, making debris fall more likely along exposed climbing paths above the high camp zones. Alika Kowalsski was 29, a fitness influencer from Los Angeles, who had built her following by documenting her transition from yoga instruction to adventure lifestyle branding. She had completed several moderate hikes, but had no technical high-altitude climbing experience. Kowalski planned to summit Everest partly as content for a sponsorship agreement with an outdoor equipment company. She frequently paused during ascent to film personal updates, treating the mountain environment primarily as a visual background rather than a high-risk survival zone. The upper Everest route above the camp system consists of exposed granite, ice fragments, and steep slope sections continuously affected by wind erosion and temperature fluctuation. June daytime heating can destabilize frost-fractured rock layers that were previously held together by freezing nighttime conditions. Even small structural failures high above can release debris that accelerates downhill under gravity. Expedition safety briefings had warned climbers about rock instability during warming cycles. Several climbers moved quickly through exposed zones to minimize time spent under steep rock faces. Kowalski, however, made frequent stops to record sponsored product footage, including extended filming sessions in areas where rapid movement was recommended. By late morning, she reached a switchback zone below the western summit wall, where the route passes directly beneath unstable cliff formations. Other climbers traversed this section at steady pace, but Kowalski stopped for nearly 20 minutes to film content featuring a branded hydration product with the summit ridge visible behind her. As sunlight struck the upper mountain wall, frost-bound granite began warming and losing structural cohesion. Approximately 200 feet above her position, a rock section began to fail. The initial collapse involved a granite slab roughly 3 feet by 2 feet, and estimated to weigh several hundred pounds. The primary fragment struck a lower ledge system and shattered into multiple pieces while triggering secondary rock displacement. Dozens of smaller stones were released, forming a cascading rockfall, moving directly down the slope. The first cracking sounds were heard moments before visual debris became visible. Kowalski attempted to move uphill, but was already positioned directly within the debris fall line. The first impact involved a stone approximately the size of a grapefruit, striking her shoulder, rotating her body, and causing loss of balance on loose trail gravel. As she fell, a larger rock fragment struck her back, likely fracturing multiple ribs and damaging her spinal structure. The fatal injury occurred when a granite fragment estimated near 80 pounds struck her head and upper chest region. The impact caused catastrophic blunt force trauma and immediate loss of consciousness. The rockfall sequence lasted approximately 8 seconds from initial structural failure to final impact. 2 climbers approximately 100 yards below witnessed the event and reported it immediately. Rescue coordination was delayed due to high winds and continuing rockfall instability. Medical and recovery teams reached the site several hours later after slope safety assessment. Kowalski was found deceased at the scene. Medical examination determined the cause of death as catastrophic blunt force trauma. Audio data from her recording equipment captured the sound of the rockfall sequence and final movement moments. Expedition safety reports later used the case to emphasize hazard awareness regarding prolonged exposure in rockfall zones on the upper slopes of Mount Everest. The incident was included in Mountain Safety Education Archives as an example of environmental risk underestimation, route discipline failure, and overconfidence in personal conditioning in high-altitude terrain. It was May 15, 2017. Camp 3 clung to the Lhotse face at 23,500 feet, a collection of small tents perched on narrow platforms carved into steep ice. The wind howled at 40 miles per hour, and the temperature had dropped to -10 degrees Fahrenheit as afternoon faded toward evening. Stephanie Harmon was 35 years old, a personal trainer and fitness studio owner from Denver who held multiple certifications in strength, conditioning, and athletic performance. She arrived convinced her training had pre-adapted her body to altitude and that standard protocols were overly conservative for someone at her fitness level. She repeatedly told other climbers that most altitude problems stemmed from poor conditioning rather than genuine physiological limitations. At 23,500 feet, atmospheric pressure is roughly 1/3 of sea level, meaning each breath delivers only 1/3 of the oxygen the body needs. Pulmonary edema occurs when low oxygen causes blood vessels in the lungs to constrict unevenly, forcing fluid into the air sacs where oxygen exchange happens. The accumulation makes breathing progressively more difficult, eventually drowning the victim. During the first rotation to Camp 2, Stephanie maintained a strong pace and showed no altitude sickness. She spent the rest day doing bodyweight exercises outside her tent. The expedition doctor explained unnecessary exertion was counterproductive, as the body needed energy for acclimatization. Stephanie dismissed this, citing muscle protein synthesis research and arguing that active recovery was superior to passive rest. During the second rotation, she again performed well, but hiked several hundred feet up the western CWM on her rest day, despite being explicitly told not to. She privately told other climbers the protocols were designed for average fitness levels, not athletes like herself. On May 14th, the team climbed from base camp to Camp 2, then continued to Camp 3 the following morning. Stephanie arrived in the early afternoon and spent 30 minutes outside organizing gear rather than resting, exposing herself to brutal cold and wind. By early evening, she had developed a dry cough. By 8 p.m., she was breathing rapidly and felt short of breath lying still. Sleep was impossible. At 10 p.m., she called to the guide, reporting difficulty breathing. He listened to her lungs and heard faint crackling. Her cough had become wet, producing pink-tinged sputum. The guide told her she needed to descend immediately. Stephanie argued that early-stage pulmonary edema could be managed with rest and supplemental oxygen. The guide was firm. Descent was not optional, and every minute of delay increased the risk. Stephanie insisted her cardiovascular system was stronger than average, and she could push through with oxygen support. When the guide remained insistent, she finally agreed, but asked to wait until morning for better visibility. The guide told her waiting was not an option. Stephanie's movements were slow as she prepared her gear, stopping frequently to catch her breath. Putting on boots and harness took nearly 20 minutes. 2 additional guides joined and clipped her into the fixed rope. The descent down the Lhotse face at night was treacherous. Stephanie's breathing was loud and ragged, audible over the wind. After descending roughly 500 feet over an hour, she sat down and could not continue. The guide placed an oxygen mask at maximum flow, but her breathing remained labored. Her lips and fingernails had taken on a bluish tint. Over the next 30 minutes, her breathing became a wet, gurgling sound. She began coughing up pink, frothy fluid, could no longer stand, and appeared confused. The guides rigged a short rope system and began lowering her down. Stephanie lost consciousness at approximately 23,000 feet, roughly 90 minutes into the descent. Her breathing became irregular, then stopped entirely at 22,800 feet. The guides performed CPR while administering oxygen with no response. Additional support arrived from Camp 2. They reached it at 3:30 a.m. The expedition doctor confirmed she had died. Stephanie had died from high-altitude pulmonary edema, progressing to complete respiratory failure. Her lungs had filled with fluid until oxygen exchange became impossible. The doctor noted that her 2-hour delay arguing about evacuation had likely been fatal. Had she descended when symptoms first appeared, survival would have been possible. Among her belongings was a training log documenting over 40 hours in hypoxic chambers, with handwritten calculations concluding she would acclimatize faster than standard protocols predicted. If you've made it this far, you already know you need the next one. It was May 23rd, 2015. Mount Everest rose to 29,032 feet on the border between Nepal and Tibet, the highest peak on Earth. The Hillary Step at 28,839 feet marked one of the final technical obstacles before the summit, where climbers queued on fixed ropes during busy weather windows. Heather Brooke was 33 years old, an accountant from San Francisco, California. She had planned this expedition as the culmination of years of training and saving. Her climbing fitness was good, and she had completed several high-altitude climbs on other mountains. She believed she could move efficiently through the summit push and handle the challenges of the death zone. Everest's summit push required climbers to navigate through the death zone above 26,000 feet, where the human body could not survive for extended periods. The Hillary Step was a near-vertical rock face requiring climbers to ascend and descend using fixed ropes. Traffic jams at the step were common during peak season, causing dangerous delays. Climbers waiting in the death zone depleted oxygen supplies and energy reserves. Frostbite, exhaustion, and oxygen deprivation could occur rapidly during delays. The expedition leader briefed the team at Camp 4 before the summit push. He explained that if traffic was heavy at the Hillary Step, they might need to turn around to avoid dangerous delays. Heather listened but made a comment about not turning back after coming this far. Another climber mentioned that waiting in line at altitude could be fatal. Heather cut him off, saying she had been planning this for years and that she could handle the wait. She added that this was her only chance and she wasn't wasting it. The team left Camp 4 after midnight. Heather climbed steadily through the darkness, using supplemental oxygen and following the fixed ropes. Progress was slow in the extreme altitude. By mid-morning, they reached the Hillary Step. A long line of climbers from multiple expeditions was queued on the ropes. The guide estimated a significant wait. The guide gathered the team and recommended they turn around due to the delay. Heather refused. She said she had come too far to turn back now. The guide explained that waiting would deplete their oxygen and energy, making the descent dangerous. Heather argued that she had enough oxygen and could manage. Other team members agreed to descend, but Heather insisted on staying. The guide reluctantly agreed to wait with her, but emphasized they would need to move quickly once through. Heather waited in line at the Hillary Step for an extended period. The temperature was well below zero. She stood clipped to the fixed rope, barely moving. Her oxygen supply was depleting steadily. Her extremities were becoming numb despite insulated gear. Finally, she reached the base of the step and began ascending the near vertical section. She summited after the extended delay. She spent several minutes on top, taking photos despite the guides urging to descend immediately. By the time they began descending, her oxygen supply was running low. She changed to her reserve cylinder. The descent back to the Hillary Step took longer than expected. Heather's movements had slowed noticeably. When they reached the step, another queue had formed for the descent. Climbers were backed up, waiting to descend the fixed ropes. The guide's concern was evident. Heather's oxygen ran out while waiting. She began using the guide's emergency supply. Her coordination deteriorated rapidly without adequate oxygen. When her turn came to descend the step, her movements were clumsy and slow. Partway down the vertical section, she lost her footing. Her weight came onto the fixed rope and safety system. She hung suspended, unable to regain her footing on the near vertical surface. The guide above tried to assist but couldn't reach her position safely. Other climbers helped lower her the rest of the way down the step. She was barely conscious. Her breathing was shallow and irregular. The guide and other climbers attempted to move her downward, but she could no longer coordinate her movements. She collapsed on the route below the Hillary Step. Despite efforts to revive her and administer oxygen from other climbers' supplies, she did not regain consciousness. She died on the route in the death zone. Her body remained on the mountain. The medical examiner determined that death resulted from severe hypoxia and exhaustion in the death zone. The extended delay at the Hillary Step had depleted her oxygen supply and energy reserves. The lack of supplemental oxygen at extreme altitude had caused rapid deterioration of brain and organ function. Contributing factors included the decision to wait in the queue, despite warnings and extended time in the death zone without adequate oxygen. The death was ruled accidental. It was June 8, 2014. Camp 3 clung to the steep Lhotse face at 24,500 feet, where the air contained only 1/3 the oxygen of sea level, and every movement required deliberate effort. The thin atmosphere and extreme cold created a hostile environment where even basic tasks became life-threatening challenges. Dolores Fitzpatrick was 51, a neighborhood association board member from suburban Illinois who had dedicated her life to creating and enforcing community regulations. She thrived on establishing order and ensuring compliance with proper procedures. Dolores had completed charity walks and several guided nature hikes in local parks, but had never camped overnight or used any technical equipment. She viewed Everest as an opportunity to demonstrate that proper planning and rule following could overcome any obstacle, treating the expedition like a community project that needed her organizational skills. The extreme altitude above 24,000 feet creates a hostile environment where the human body begins breaking down faster than it can recover. Sleep becomes nearly impossible as the brain struggles to function with reduced oxygen levels. While simple tasks require enormous effort, medical emergencies become exponentially more dangerous as evacuation options become limited by weather and terrain. The body's natural warning systems often fail at these elevations, making it difficult to recognize serious health problems before they become life-threatening. Dolores created a written schedule for base camp activities and posted it in the common area without authorization. She established quiet hours and noise restrictions for the entire expedition and demanded that all climbers sign in and out when leaving their tents. She insisted on conducting daily inspections of other climbers' gear organization and complained that meal times were too flexible and needed fixed scheduling. She requested that expedition leaders provide written reports on daily progress and criticized other climbers for not following her posted guidelines. When they ignored her unauthorized rules, she threatened to file complaints with expedition management about their non-compliance with her established procedures. On June 10th, Dolores began showing severe altitude sickness symptoms and headache, vomiting, and confusion. The expedition doctor recommended immediate descent and prescribed medication, but she refused both treatments. She insisted her herbal remedies were sufficient and accused the medical team of trying to force unnecessary drugs on her. Her condition deteriorated rapidly as she continued to reject medical intervention. Fellow climbers observed her stumbling around the camp, unable to walk in straight lines, yet she insisted on maintaining her daily inspection routine. She attempted to organize her belongings repeatedly, forgetting what she had just done and starting over again. Her speech became increasingly slurred as she tried to give orders to other climbers who watched in growing alarm. The altitude sickness affected her judgment so severely that she began accusing the medical team of conspiracy and incompetence. She threw her prescribed medication into the snow, claiming it was poison designed to make her dependent on the medical establishment. Other climbers tried to reason with her, but she responded with increasingly paranoid accusations about plots to undermine her authority. Her coordination failed as she attempted to write additional rules and regulations, her handwriting becoming illegible scrawls. By evening, her symptoms had progressed to include difficulty walking and slurred speech, indicating possible cerebral edema. Other climbers observed her applying essential oils to her temples and consuming herbal tinctures instead of taking prescribed medication. At 11:30 p.m., she was found unconscious in her tent by her tentmate. Her breathing was labored and irregular, and she was unresponsive to verbal stimuli. The tentmate immediately alerted the expedition doctor at 11:35 p.m. Medical assessment revealed signs of high-altitude cerebral edema, altered consciousness, and ataxia. Emergency descent was initiated, but her condition deteriorated rapidly during transport. Radio contact with base medical was established, but evacuation from that altitude in darkness was impossible. Dolores died at 3:20 a.m. on June 11th during the emergency descent. The medical examiner's report listed cause of death as high-altitude cerebral edema, with contributing factors of refusal of standard medical treatment and delayed descent. Evidence recovered from her tent included unused prescription altitude medication and various herbal supplements. The investigation noted that early medical intervention could have prevented the fatal outcome. It was April 22nd, 2015. The spring climbing season on Mount Everest was underway, with expedition teams making acclimatization rotations. At base camp at 17,600 feet, climbers were preparing for their second rotation. Tessa Hargrove was 39, a lifestyle blogger from Scottsdale, Arizona. Everest was her most ambitious project, a series she'd pre-sold to outdoor gear companies as sponsored content. She'd spent more money on camera equipment than proper cold weather gear. Her jacket was rated only to minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit, inadequate for Everest where temperatures drop below minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. During the trek to base camp, Tessa complained constantly about accommodations, food, and pace. She treated porters dismissively, referring to them as the help At tea houses, she insisted on private rooms and threatened bad reviews when told she'd have to share. During the first rotation, Tessa stopped frequently for photos, forcing others to wait. When teammates expressed frustration, she responded that her sponsors expected content and she was paying for the expedition. At Camp 1 at 19,500 feet, she spent 2 hours staging tent photos while teammates rested. On April 22nd, the team began their second rotation through the Khumbu icefall. The climb started at 3 a.m. when ice was most stable. Tessa moved slowly, stopping repeatedly. Other climbers had to navigate around her. When her guide urged her to maintain pace, she snapped that he was being unprofessional and she'd document his attitude for the expedition company. At one point, she removed her gloves for 5 minutes to operate her camera in minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit temperatures, demanding her guide hold her ice axe. Her fingers turned white, then red. The guide told her to put gloves back on. Tessa accused him of overreacting. They reached Camp 1 and continued to Camp 2 at 21,000 feet the next day. At Camp 2, Tessa's oxygen saturation was 68%, acceptable. She complained of headache and fatigue, but dismissed these as minor. The plan was to rest briefly, then descend to Camp 1 before nightfall. At 2 p.m., as the team prepared to descend, Tessa announced she was staying longer to photograph the Lhotse face. Her guide explained they needed to descend before afternoon heat destabilized the route. Tessa responded that her sponsors expected specific shots, and she wasn't leaving until she got them. She'd paid for this expedition and would decide when to leave. After heated argument, the guide gave her a deadline. 2:30 p.m. Tessa spent 30 minutes taking photographs, changing jackets 3 times for different looks. She demanded other climbers move out of her frame. Each time she removed layers, her body lost heat. By departure, her fingers were numb. The guide examined her hands. Early frostbite. Tessa blamed him for not warning her properly. The descent was slow. Tessa's coordination was impaired. She stumbled repeatedly. By 4 p.m., they'd only descended halfway. At approximately 19,800 feet, Tessa sat down, saying she needed rest. The guide checked her oxygen saturation, 62%. Her speech was slurred. He urged her to continue. She stood but sat back down, reporting dizziness and nausea. The guide recognized acute mountain sickness and administered emergency oxygen. The oxygen helped initially, but Tessa couldn't walk. The guide and assistant began dragging her downward. Progress was agonizingly slow. At approximately 5:15 p.m., at 19,600 feet, Tessa suddenly pulled away and stumbled sideways off the route. She took 3 steps onto untracked snow. The snow collapsed beneath her. She'd stepped onto a snow bridge, covering a crevasse. The bridge gave way, and Tessa fell through. The guide rushed to the edge. The crevasse was 8 feet wide, narrowing as it descended. He could see Tessa approximately 40 feet down, wedged between ice walls, not moving. He called her name repeatedly. No response. He radioed an emergency call. A rescue team arrived 90 minutes later after dark. A rescuer descended and reached Tessa 40 feet below the surface. Wedged between ice walls, the rescuer checked for vital signs. None. Tessa was dead. Her oxygen mask had been torn off during the fall. Recovery took 3 hours. Tessa's body was brought to Camp 1, then carried to base camp the next day. The official cause of death was trauma from the fall, combined with hypoxia and hypothermia. Contributing factors included altitude sickness, inadequate cold weather gear leading to frostbite, and exhaustion from prioritizing photography over proper acclimatization. The guide's logs documented repeated warnings, her dismissive responses, and threats regarding his conduct. Her camera was recovered with her body, containing hundreds of photos from the days before her death. The expedition company added protocols requiring guides to confiscate cameras if clients prioritized photography over safety. Tessa Hargrove's body was returned to Arizona for burial. It was October 14th, 2016, on the upper roots of Mount Everest, where autumn weather can quickly change from clear skies to storm condition. Above the lower camps, the terrain is exposed granite and ice with little natural shelter, and strong winds can rapidly bring freezing precipitation and reduced visibility. Medley Siana was 31, a real estate agent from Denver who had recently taken up mountaineering as a recreational achievement challenge. She had successfully climbed several lower elevation peaks during summer seasons under stable weather conditions. Siana viewed high altitude climbing primarily as a personal milestone rather than a long-term technical skill requiring specialized alpine experience. She publicly aimed to complete multiple major climbs before her next birthday, expressing confidence that physical fitness and determination were sufficient preparation. The route above the mid-camp zone on Everest consists of exposed rock and ice scrambling sections where precise hand and foot placement is required. October mountain conditions often involve extreme temperature drops, strong wind currents, and rapidly forming ice layers on rock surfaces. When moisture combines with freezing wind exposure, granite and ice paths can become extremely slippery. Hypothermia risk increases sharply when climbers are exposed to wet wind without protective shelter. Weather briefings issued by expedition guides warned of high-altitude wind activity later in the day. Some climbers delayed summit rotations. After reviewing the forecast, Siana began her ascent early under relatively calm sky conditions, dismissing the warning as conservative risk messaging. She progressed efficiently toward the upper route zone, maintaining steady pace and confidence in her physical endurance. Across the climbing path, and atmospheric visibility started decreasing. Siana continued upward, believing that turning back was unnecessary since she was already deep into the ascent zone. This decision reflected strong reliance on personal judgment rather than environmental risk indicators. Front arrived, bringing wind speeds exceeding 60 miles per hour and horizontal sleet. Visibility dropped to less than 10 feet within minutes as ice particles coated exposed granite and rock surfaces. Siana attempted to continue upward rather than retreat towards safer lower ground. During traversal of a narrow ridge segment, she misinterpreted route markers under low visibility and began climbing a steeper rock face instead of following the fixed ledge system. Approximately 20 minutes into the storm, her left foot lost traction on iced granite. She attempted to grab a handhold but encountered smooth, wet rock surfaces. Her body shifted backward, losing contact with the climbing line. She fell approximately 40 feet down a rock wall, striking several protruding stone edges before landing on a narrow ledge platform. The fall resulted in a compound fracture of her left leg, multiple rib fractures, and a serious head injury. Siana was stranded on a ledge, roughly 8 feet wide, fully exposed to wind-driven snow and sleet. Over the following hours, progressive hypothermia developed as moisture penetrated her clothing system. Shock from traumatic injuries further impaired cognitive function as core body temperature declined. Siana activated her personal emergency beacon during the fall. Rescue authorities received the signal, but aerial evacuation was impossible due to sustained high winds and poor visibility across the upper mountain zone. Search and rescue teams remained grounded until weather conditions improved. A recovery team reached the location the following morning. Siana was found deceased on the ledge. Medical review determined cause of death as severe hypothermia compounded by traumatic injuries and prolonged environmental exposure. Beacon telemetry data suggested survival for several hours after the fall. The incident was later documented in expedition safety summaries as a preventable exposure fatality associated with delayed descent. Environmental risk underestimation and overconfidence in physical conditioning on the upper slopes of Mount Everest. It was April 12, 2015. The Khumbu Icefall stretched ahead at 17,900 feet, a maze of shifting ice towers and hidden crevasses on the lower slopes of Mount Everest. The morning sun had already begun softening the ice, making the route more unstable with each passing hour. Meredith Tennyson was 29 years old, a travel writer from Portland who had documented budget adventures across Southeast Asia and South America. When the expedition company sent pre-trip training recommendations, she dismissed them as excessive, reasoning that she had paid for professional guides to handle the difficult parts. She arrived in Nepal having done no altitude training, no weighted pack work, and minimal cardiovascular conditioning. She had repeatedly emailed the company questioning why porter services weren't more comprehensive. The Khumbu Icefall sits at the base of Everest's western Sea Badawam, a constantly shifting labyrinth where massive ice blocks balance precariously on the moving Khumbu Glacier. The glacier flows downward at roughly 3 to 4 feet per day, causing the ice to crack and collapse without warning. The route requires climbers to navigate aluminum ladders lashed together across deep crevasses, spanning 20 feet or more. The expedition leader conducted a briefing at base camp, explaining that climbers must carry their own packs through technical sections. Meredith immediately interrupted, stating she expected Sherpas to handle gear transport. The guide explained that safety regulations required self-sufficiency, but Meredith argued the policy was about cutting costs. During practice sessions, she struggled badly with ladder crossings and rejected suggestions for additional training, stating the guide's job was to get her up the mountain. On the morning of April 12th, the team departed base camp at 3 a.m. Within the first hour, Meredith fell behind, stopping frequently and demanding to know why a Sherpa couldn't carry her camera bag. By the time they reached the first major ladder crossing at dawn, she had been climbing for nearly 4 hours and was visibly exhausted. At approximately 7:30 a.m., they reached a section where 3 aluminum ladders spanned a crevasse roughly 30 feet wide. Meredith clipped in and started across, but her exhausted legs shook with each step. Halfway across, she stopped moving entirely, frozen as the ladders swayed. She remained motionless for nearly 3 minutes before reaching the far side in near panic. She sat down immediately, refusing to continue. When the guide explained they needed to keep moving as the ice was becoming unstable, Meredith snapped that she was the client and would rest as long as she needed. After 15 minutes, they continued upward. At 9:15 a.m., another crossing took nearly 8 minutes. Once across, she blamed the guide for pushing too hard. The guide made a radio call, and the decision was made to descend back to base camp. At 10:45 a.m., while descending, Meredith unclipped from the fixed rope and wandered roughly 15 feet to the side to photograph the route. The guide immediately called for her to return. She ignored him, taking 3 more steps onto what appeared to be solid ice. The surface collapsed beneath her, and she dropped through a hidden snow bridge into a crevasse, falling approximately 40 feet before wedging between the narrowing ice walls. The guide immediately radioed for help and anchored himself at the edge. 2 Sherpas arrived within 30 minutes with rescue equipment. One Sherpa was lowered into the crevasse and found Meredith wedged at the shoulders, semi-conscious and bleeding from a head wound. They rigged a complex pulley system and spent over 90 minutes extracting her. She emerged with frostbite on her exposed right hand, severe exhaustion, a head injury, and signs of hypothermia. She could not stand without support. The descent to base camp took nearly 5 hours. By 4 p.m., Meredith had stopped responding to questions. At 4:50 p.m., roughly 200 yards from base camp, she collapsed completely. The team carried her the remaining distance, but she had stopped breathing by the time they reached the medical tent. Resuscitation attempts continued for 40 minutes without success. The medical officer determined that Meredith had died from a combination of head trauma, severe hypothermia, and cardiac arrest. The fall had caused a skull fracture and significant blood loss, while her core temperature had dropped to critical levels during the extended period. Wedged in the crevasse, the extended time at altitude without proper acclimatization, combined with physical trauma and extreme cold, had overwhelmed her body's ability to survive. The official cause of death was listed as traumatic injuries and hypothermia sustained in a crevasse. It was May 11th, 2017. Mount Everest rose to 29,032 feet on the border between Nepal and Tibet, the highest peak on Earth. At Camp 2 in the western CWM, climbers rested in their tents at 21,000 feet, preparing for rotations to higher camps. Shelby Fairchild was 51 years old, a grandmother and part-time yoga instructor from Greenwich, Connecticut. She had recently become a grandmother and wanted to prove she was still capable of major physical achievements. She had paid significant money for a guided Everest expedition using inheritance funds. Her climbing experience included guided trips to Kilimanjaro and a failed attempt on Aconcagua, where she had turned back due to altitude sickness. She was fit for her age but had never spent extended time above 20,000 feet. She viewed the expedition as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity and was determined to be the grandmother who summited Everest. Everest's extreme altitude created severe physiological challenges. Above 21,000 feet, the body deteriorated rapidly. Oxygen levels were a fraction of sea level. Altitude sickness could progress from mild symptoms to life-threatening conditions within hours. High-altitude pulmonary edema involved fluid accumulation in the lungs, causing breathing difficulty and chest tightness. The only effective treatment was rapid descent to lower elevation. Supplemental oxygen provided temporary relief, but was not a substitute for descent. Climbers needed to carry their own equipment and maintain self-sufficiency even with guide support. The expedition had spent weeks acclimatizing through rotations between camps. Shelby had complained of headaches for multiple days, but insisted they were tension headaches from stress. The lead guide conducted daily health checks. At Camp 2, Shelby's oxygen saturation was measured below the normal range for that altitude. She had developed a persistent dry cough. The guide recommended descending to base camp for rest and monitoring. Shelby refused, stating she was on a schedule and needed to continue upward to Camp 3. She had been asking guides to carry portions of her gear since lower camps. The guides explained that each climber needed to manage their own equipment for safety and self-sufficiency. Shelby argued that she had paid for a premium service and expected accommodation. She stated that carrying equipment was what guides were for. The guides explained that at extreme altitude, each person needed to be self-sufficient. Shelby became irritated and mentioned the significant amount of money she had invested in the expedition. By evening, Shelby's cough had worsened, and she was breathing more rapidly than normal. She had difficulty sleeping despite supplemental oxygen. The next morning, the guide strongly recommended she descend immediately to base camp. Shelby refused, saying she hadn't paid thousands of dollars to turn back. She insisted the symptoms were minor and would improve with rest. The guide explained that her symptoms indicated possible pulmonary edema and that continuing upward could be fatal. Shelby became angry and accused them of trying to end the expedition early. She threatened to leave negative reviews and contact the company owner. After extensive discussion, the guides made the decision to begin descending with her, explaining they would not allow her to continue upward in this condition. The descent began mid-morning. Shelby moved slowly, stopping frequently. Her breathing was labored, and she was coughing more frequently. As they descended through the western WM toward base camp, she was coughing up small amounts of pink, frothy fluid. The guides increased the pace of descent. Shelby's breathing became increasingly difficult. Her lips had a bluish tint. She stopped and sat down in the snow. The guides administered supplemental oxygen from the emergency supply. They helped her to her feet and supported her weight as they continued descending. Her cough produced more pink froth. As they continued lower, her breathing had become a wet, gurgling sound. She could no longer walk, even with support. The guides radioed ahead for assistance. Additional team members came up from base camp with a rescue sled. Her consciousness was fading. Her breathing became irregular and gasping. The guides placed her on the sled and began moving her downward as quickly as possible. She stopped breathing. They performed resuscitation efforts while continuing to descend toward base camp. She remained unresponsive. They confirmed death after extended efforts. The medical examiner's report listed the cause of death as high-altitude pulmonary edema. The lungs had filled with fluid, preventing oxygen from entering the bloodstream. Contributing factors included inadequate acclimatization response, refusal to descend despite early symptoms, and delayed descent when symptoms became severe. The examiner noted that pulmonary edema was reversible with prompt descent, and that her death could likely have been prevented if she had descended when first advised. The delay had allowed the condition to progress beyond recovery. It was March 15th, 2017. The route between Camp 1 and Camp 2 stretched across exposed ice slopes at 20,500 feet, where sudden weather changes could trap climbers in whiteout conditions within minutes. Storm clouds were building on the horizon, threatening to engulf the mountain in dangerous conditions. Janet Middlesworth was 45, a retail district manager from Arizona who had spent 20 years supervising employees and enforcing company standards. She believed that proper management and clear expectations could solve any problem, including mountain climbing. Janet had zero mountaineering experience beyond weekend hikes in desert terrain, had never used crampons or an ice axe, and had never been in snow deeper than a few inches. She chose Everest specifically because it was the most challenging goal she could imagine, viewing it as the ultimate management test. The exposed ridges and ice slopes between camps offer no protection from sudden weather changes that can engulf the mountain without warning. Navigation becomes extremely challenging when visibility drops, as familiar landmarks disappear and GPS devices can malfunction in extreme conditions. The narrow routes and steep terrain leave little room for error when weather conditions deteriorate rapidly. Climbers must rely entirely on their guides' experience and local knowledge to navigate safely through these treacherous sections. Janet demanded to see the credentials and certifications of all guides, insisting they provide detailed itineraries with exact timing for each section of the climb. She complained that the guides weren't wearing proper identification badges or uniforms, and requested daily performance evaluations be conducted on all expedition staff. She criticized the guides for not maintaining professional appearance standards and demanded that all safety briefings be provided in writing with her approval. She insisted on reviewing and approving all route decisions before implementation, treating the experienced guides like subordinate employees. When the 23-year-old guide, who had summited Everest 6 times, began leading the descent using GPS and terrain familiarity, Janet fell approximately 20 feet behind the group, refusing to maintain the required close formation. At 3:15 p.m., visibility dropped to 0 as the storm intensified. Janet complained loudly about the guide's competence and demanded to speak with a more senior guide. At 3:45 p.m., she became completely separated from the group when she chose to follow what she believed was a better route. The guide noticed her absence and immediately began search protocols, but the whiteout conditions made visual contact impossible. The storm's intensity made communication impossible as wind howled across the exposed slopes. Janet's voice, calling for help, was immediately swallowed by the roaring wind, and her attempts to use her radio produced only static. The blowing snow stung her exposed face and began accumulating on her goggles, further reducing her already limited visibility. Her expensive GPS device showed conflicting readings due to the extreme weather conditions, leaving her completely disoriented. As hypothermia began setting in, Janet's decision-making became increasingly impaired. She continued to move in what she believed was the correct direction, but her path led further away from safety with each step. The cold penetrated her clothing as she struggled against the wind, and her movements became sluggish and uncoordinated. Ice began forming on her breathing apparatus, making each breath more difficult as the storm raged around her isolated position. Janet continued descending in the wrong direction, moving further from the established route. By 4:30 p.m., she was completely lost and began showing signs of panic and hypothermia. The guide radioed base camp at 4 p.m., reporting a missing climber. Search teams were organized, but the storm conditions prevented immediate deployment. GPS tracking showed Janet's last known position, moving away from the safe descent route. Radio attempts to contact her personal device received no response. The storm continued for 8 hours, preventing any rescue attempts until the following morning. Janet's body was found 400 yards from the established route, approximately 1,000 feet below where she was last seen. The medical examiner determined cause of death was severe hypothermia, with contributing factors of exposure and exhaustion. Evidence showed she had attempted to build a snow shelter, but lacked proper technique. The investigation concluded that failure to follow guide instructions and separation from the group during whiteout conditions led to her death. It was May 19, 2016. Weather conditions on Mount Everest were deteriorating after a brief summit window had closed the previous day. Other teams were still high on the mountain, racing against worsening conditions. Felicity Whitmore was 46 from Minneapolis, Minnesota, where she ran an event planning company built on rigid schedules. Before leaving for Nepal, she created a comprehensive spreadsheet detailing every day of the expedition, specific time blocks for each activity, exact dates for each camp, the precise day she would summit. The guide explained that Everest doesn't follow schedules. Weather and conditions dictate timing. Felicity responded that proper planning prevents problems. The expedition deviated from her schedule almost immediately. Weather delays put them 2 days behind. Felicity became visibly stressed. During acclimatization, her inflexibility created constant friction. When the guide recommended extra rest due to high winds, Felicity refused, stating rest was scheduled for the following day. By mid-May, her schedule had become disconnected from reality. On May 17th, Felicity's team moved to Camp 3. The plan was to move to Camp 4 on May 18th, then attempt the summit that night. At Camp 3, the guide emphasized a turnaround time of 1 p.m. on May 19th, regardless of position. Felicity argued that 1 p.m. was too early. The guide stated firmly that clients who didn't agree would not be permitted to attempt the summit. The team moved to Camp 4 on May 18th. Felicity arrived at 3 p.m., exhausted. Oxygen saturation 61%. The guide told her to rest before the summit push at 10 p.m. Felicity spent the rest period checking gear and reviewing her timeline. She barely rested. The summit push began at 10 p.m. Conditions were marginal. Higher winds than forecasted temperature minus 42 degrees Fahrenheit, Felicity climbed aggressively, pushing past other climbers. The guide repeatedly told her to maintain steady pace. Felicity ignored him. By midnight, she was ahead of her group. At 1 a.m., her pace began to slow. They reached the balcony at 27,500 feet around 4 a.m. Behind her calculated pace, she became visibly agitated. The climb to the south summit was brutal. Winds increased to 40 to 50 miles per hour. Wind chill approaching minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit. By the time they reached the south summit at 28,700 feet, around 7:30 a.m., she was completely exhausted. She collapsed in the snow, unable to stand. The guide assessed her condition: coherent but extremely fatigued, oxygen saturation 56%, movement slow and uncoordinated. He decided they would not continue. They would descend. Felicity refused. The guide explained she was exhausted, weather was deteriorating, and they needed to descend. Felicity checked her watch. Only 7:30 a.m. They had until 1 p.m. The guide explained the turnaround time was for being back at this position and descending, not for reaching the summit. The guide stated firmly they were descending. Felicity refused to move. After 10 minutes, the guide told her he was descending with or without her. Felicity stated she was continuing. The guide radioed base camp. They advised him to descend. He made one final attempt. She refused. He began descending around 7:50 a.m. Felicity rested 20 minutes, then climbed toward the summit at extremely slow pace. At 9:30 a.m., she reached the Hillary Step, taking 45 minutes to ascend it. The final 200 feet took another 45 minutes. She reached the summit around 11 a.m., alone. She sat down, too exhausted to stand, and remained 15 minutes before descending. The descent was catastrophic. By the time she descended the Hillary Step around 12:30 p.m., she'd been moving for 13 and a half hours. Her pace slowed to 50 feet every 10 minutes. At 1 p.m., the turnaround time, she was still at 28,600 feet. She sat down, unable to continue. She tried to radio but couldn't operate it. Cognitive function severely impaired. At 1:30 p.m., weather deteriorated sharply. Wind increased to 60+ miles per hour. Visibility dropped. Snow fell. At 2 p.m., climbers found Felicity sitting unresponsive. She was conscious but severely hypothermic and unable to move. They radioed base camp. Base camp told them to do what they could, then descend. The climbers gave her an oxygen bottle at maximum flow and tried setting up shelter, but wind was too strong. After 30 minutes, they descended at 2:45 p.m. No one else passed her position. At some point during the afternoon or evening, Felicity Whitmore died from hypothermia, exhaustion, and hypoxia. Her body was found May 21st, frozen solid, where the climbers had left her. The oxygen bottle was empty. Official cause of death was exposure and hypothermia with contributing factors of exhaustion and hypoxia. The investigation noted she'd summited more than 3 hours after her guide recommended turning back and been caught by forecasted deteriorating weather. It was March 15th, 2016. On the upper slopes of Mount Everest above the South Col, dense cloud cover limited visibility, while strong winds swept across the exposed ridgelines. The extreme cold and thin air of the world's highest peak created conditions where prolonged exposure quickly became life-threatening. Melia Amelia was a 21-year-old marketing professional from Boston who had recently completed her first marathon. She often framed physical challenges as extensions of her personal identity and brand presence, sharing training milestones online. Seeking a defining achievement, she joined a commercial Everest expedition despite experience limited to lower elevation summer hiking. Amelia believed her fitness training, premium equipment, and guided expedition structure were sufficient to offset her lack of high-altitude mountaineering experience. During pre-climb briefings, guides emphasized worsening weather along the upper mountain. Several climbers postponed summit rotations after reviewing forecasts predicting strong winds and severe wind chill. Amelia chose to continue. She displayed confidence that her preparation level and equipment quality placed her above typical risk thresholds. Safety warnings were interpreted as general caution rather than immediate operational danger. Although wearing technical outer layers, she relied partially on moisture-retaining base clothing that was less effective during prolonged sub-zero exposure. As the team climbed higher, winds intensified and blowing snow reduced visibility. Amelia began showing early fatigue, breathing heavily and slowing, despite maintaining a regulated pace. Sherpa staff observed that her inner layers were damp from perspiration, which significantly reduces insulation efficiency in extreme cold. Suggestions to adjust clothing or pacing were offered, but she continued without making substantial changes. On an exposed ridge section above partial snow shelter, Amelia stopped in open wind to adjust her pack. Remaining stationary allowed strong gusts to penetrate her moisture-compromised insulation system. In high-altitude environments, even short pauses in strong wind can accelerate core temperature decline when clothing layers are damp from exertion. To continue along the fixed rope line, blowing snow further reduced visibility, and her phone battery failed in the cold, eliminating GPS navigation reference. She drifted slightly off the marked path into a more exposed slope section. As core temperature dropped, fine motor control deteriorated, making it difficult to manage climbing hardware or secure clothing. Sherpa staff noted repeated stumbling and difficulty maintaining the balance along the fixed line. Minor falls onto hard snow and ice caused superficial injuries, while prolonged exposure and altitude hypoxia worsened cognitive function and reaction speed. Her condition progressed into advanced hypothermia, marked by confusion and poor directional judgment. She attempted to shelter behind a small snow formation, but protection was minimal. As body temperature declined further, paradoxical undressing behavior was observed before she lost consciousness during assisted descent attempts toward lower camp. Emergency communication was transmitted once satellite signal became available. However, sustained high winds and low visibility prevented immediate evacuation by air. Rescue operations at extreme altitude depend on weather windows, and conditions did not allow rapid response. Support personnel remained with her as long as environmental conditions permitted. When weather briefly stabilized, recovery teams located her body a short distance from the fixed route, partially covered by wind-blown snow. Medical review determined the cause of death to be severe hypothermia, compounded by hypoxia and exhaustion. Equipment inspection confirmed moisture-saturated base layers and reduced insulation performance. Tracking and communication records showed deviation from the primary climbing line. The incident was later recorded in expedition safety analyses as a preventable exposure fatality associated with delayed descent, inadequate thermal management, and overconfidence in physical conditioning. On the upper slopes of Mount Everest, small errors in judgment can eliminate the narrow margin between survival and irreversible exposure. It was May 3, 2014. The Khumbu Icefall loomed above base camp at 17,900 feet, its chaotic maze of ice towers and crevasses representing the first major obstacle on the route to Everest's summit. The pre-dawn darkness was absolute, broken only by the headlamps of climbers beginning their ascent. Judith Rothell was 48 years old, a recent divorcee from Greenwich, Connecticut, whose 22-year marriage had ended acrimoniously 8 months earlier. Her ex-husband had said during their final argument that she had never accomplished anything on her own. Judith fixated on this and decided summiting Everest would be the ultimate proof of his wrongness. She had no mountaineering experience beyond a corporate team-building hike, but had significant financial resources and assumed hiring the most expensive expedition company would compensate for her lack of preparation. She spent 3 months doing sporadic gym sessions and 1 weekend hiking before departing for Nepal. When the company sent pre-trip training requirements, she responded that she was paying premium rates and expected the guides to handle everything. The Khumbu Icefall is a frozen waterfall of glacial ice descending 2,000 feet, moving downhill at several feet per day and constantly reshaping itself. The route requires navigating aluminum ladders across crevasses while carrying packs weighing 30 to 40 pounds, demanding upper body strength, core stability, and cardiovascular endurance. During the pre-expedition briefing, the lead guide explained that climbers must carry their own packs through technical sections. Judith immediately interrupted, stating she had paid premium rates and expected Sherpas to handle all gear. The guide explained safety regulations required self-sufficiency. Judith argued loudly that other companies offered full porter service and accused the company of false advertising, threatening negative reviews if the policy wasn't changed. The expedition included 3 days of training. Judith struggled badly, showing poor balance and falling twice during practice. When the guide suggested she reconsider the expedition, given her lack of experience, Judith demanded to speak to management and insisted the guide's job was to get her to the summit regardless of her skill level. On May 3rd, the team departed base camp at 2:30 a.m. Judith immediately fell behind. Within the first hour, she demanded a Sherpa carry her pack, becoming hostile when told it was impossible, and complained the company had deliberately misled her about the difficulty. By the time they reached the first major ladder, crossing at dawn, she had been climbing nearly 4 hours and was exhausted. She froze at the ladder's edge while other groups backed up behind them. After 15 minutes, she finally crossed, taking nearly 10 minutes to complete it. The team continued upward. Judith's pace deteriorated to roughly 100 feet every 20 minutes. By 9 a.m., they had covered less than half the distance to Camp 1. At a near vertical ice wall, Judith attempted to climb but lacked the strength. After 3 attempts, she sat down and stated she could not continue, blaming the guide for failing to provide adequate support. The guide radioed for 2 Sherpas from base camp, a wait of at least 2 hours. Judith sat silently, no longer responding. At 10:45 a.m., Judith suddenly stood and announced she needed photos to document her experience. Before the guide could stop her, she unclipped from the fixed rope and walked approximately 15 feet to her right. The guide immediately called for her to return. She ignored him, taking 3 more steps onto snow-covered ice. The surface collapsed beneath her and she dropped into a crevasse, her scream cutting off as she disappeared into darkness. The guide radioed for emergency assistance. 2 Sherpas arrived within 30 minutes. One was lowered into the crevasse and found Judith's body at approximately 80 feet, wedged between narrowing ice walls, not breathing, with no pulse and her neck bent at an unnatural angle. Extraction took nearly 3 hours. She was pronounced dead at 6:30 p.m. Death had been nearly instantaneous. A fractured skull and broken neck from an 80-foot fall against ice walls. The investigation noted she had unclipped from the fixed rope herself, leaving no safety system to arrest the fall. No findings of negligence were made against the expedition team. Her phone was recovered intact. The final photos on it were wide shots of the ice fall, time-stamped 4 minutes before she fell. It was May 8, 2016. Mount Everest rose to 29,032 feet on the border between Nepal and Tibet, the highest peak on Earth. Advanced Base Camp on the north side sat at 21,300 feet, where climbers acclimatize before attempting higher camps during the narrow weather windows of climbing season. Valerie Hutchkins was 38 years old, a housewife from Boston, Massachusetts. Her husband was a surgeon, and she had arranged childcare for their 2 children specifically for this expedition. Her climbing experience included guided trips to lower altitude peaks during favorable conditions, but she had never climbed above 20,000 feet. She had planned this Everest expedition for over a year as a personal challenge. She viewed weather forecasts with skepticism, believing they were often exaggerated to avoid liability. Everest's upper camps involved extreme altitude and exposure to severe weather. May marked the brief climbing season, but conditions remained unpredictable with sudden storms. Temperatures could drop to -40 degrees Fahrenheit with wind chill. The route above Camp 2 crossed exposed terrain with limited shelter. Supplemental oxygen became increasingly important at higher elevations. Equipment failure or exposure at extreme altitude could be fatal within hours. The expedition leader had received weather reports predicting dangerous wind speeds and deteriorating conditions for the upper mountain. Forecasts showed a storm system moving in earlier than the planned weather window. The leader called a meeting the evening before to postpone the move to Camp 3 at 25,000 feet. Valerie argued for over 15 minutes about the decision. The leader explained that conditions exceeded safe parameters for the team. Valerie stated she had arranged her entire schedule around this expedition and had paid significant money. The leader offered to wait for better conditions in several days. Valerie refused, saying this was her only opportunity and that she had already been away from her children for weeks. The next morning before dawn, she left Camp 2 without her team. Other climbers noticed her heading up the route alone. She carried supplemental oxygen, but her pack appeared lighter than recommended. Another climber called out to her about the weather forecast. Valerie responded that forecasts were usually wrong and that she had proper gear. She insisted she knew her capabilities. The other climber returned to his tent. She climbed through the early morning, following the fixed ropes. The first several hours were manageable as she gained elevation. Higher up, Wind speeds increased noticeably. She continued upward into more exposed terrain. Valerie reached higher on the route by mid-morning. Cloud cover had moved in and light snow began falling. Wind speeds had increased significantly. She pulled her down suit tighter and continued climbing. Visibility dropped steadily as conditions worsened. She paused at a section of fixed rope to adjust her oxygen mask. Her fingers were becoming clumsy. Despite insulated gloves, she continued for another stretch, gaining more elevation. A particularly strong gust knocked her off balance. She stumbled and fell against rock. Her down suit tore on the exposed edge. Wind began penetrating the damaged section. She stood and tried to continue, but the wind had intensified to dangerous levels. Visibility had decreased to only a few feet. She could barely see the fixed ropes ahead. She attempted to descend, but her coordination was deteriorating. Her movements became increasingly erratic as altitude and cold took their toll. The conditions made it difficult to navigate, even with the fixed lines. She moved slowly, expending energy, and losing body heat through the damaged suit. She began shivering. Snow accumulated on her clothing and equipment. She found a small area behind a rock outcrop and crouched down. The wind still reached her at that elevation. Over the next hours, her shivering decreased. As her core temperature dropped, she became lethargic. Her oxygen supply was running low. She attempted to change the cylinder, but her coordination had failed. Her breathing became shallow and irregular. She slumped against the rocks. Her body was found 3 days later by a team moving between camps, located off the main route where she had sheltered. She was partially buried by snow that had accumulated during the storm. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death as severe hypothermia, combined with altitude-related complications. The damaged down suit had accelerated heat loss at extreme altitude. She had been inadequately prepared for solo climbing in deteriorating conditions, lacking backup support and sufficient oxygen reserves. Her oxygen system showed she had depleted her supply. The death was determined to be accidental. It was May 12, 2016. Base camp at 17,598 feet sprawled across the rocky moraine like a temporary city of colorful tents and prayer flags, while climbers made final preparations in the thin air before dawn. The weather window for summit attempts was closing rapidly, creating an atmosphere of urgency and tension throughout the camp. Magnolia Ashworth was 42, a pharmaceutical heiress from Connecticut who was accustomed to having staff anticipate her every need. Money had always solved her problems, and she expected the same level of service she received at luxury resorts. She had completed 3 guided climbs in Colorado's 14ers and spent a week at a mountaineering school in France, though she had never been above 14,500 feet or used technical climbing equipment extensively. The expedition cost her $85,000, which she considered a guarantee of premium treatment and priority access throughout the climb. The Khumbu Icefall contains some of the world's most dangerous terrain, with massive ice blocks constantly shifting and creating hidden crevasses up to 100 feet deep. Snow bridges over these crevasses can appear solid, but collapse without warning under a climber's weight. The icefall moves up to 3 feet per day, making safe routes obsolete within hours and requiring constant vigilance from climbers navigating the unstable terrain. Fixed ropes and ladder systems provide the only safe passage through this deadly maze of ice and snow. Magnolia demanded her tent be moved to a more level spot, claiming the current location was unacceptable for someone of her status. She insisted on being served meals first, arguing that her dietary restrictions required priority attention over other climbers. When other team members made noise during gear preparation, she complained loudly and demanded they be quieter during her rest periods. She refused to carry her share of group equipment, stating she had paid extra to avoid such responsibilities. When told she couldn't skip acclimatization rotations, she asked to speak with expedition management immediately. She criticized the quality of base camp facilities and demanded upgrades to her accommodation, threatening to leave negative reviews if her concerns weren't addressed. The expedition leader briefed all climbers about rope discipline and wading protocols, but Magnolia repeatedly interrupted to ask about special arrangements for premium clients. At 6:45 a.m., approximately 1,000 feet above base camp in the Khumbu Icefall, Magnolia became impatient with the pace of climbers ahead. She unclipped from the fixed rope system and attempted to pass the line of climbers on unstable snow to the left. The area was marked with warning flags indicating crevasse danger. As she stepped onto what appeared to be solid snow, the thin snow bridge collapsed under her weight. The sound of cracking snow echoed through the icefall as the bridge gave way beneath her feet. Other climbers shouted warnings, but the collapse happened too quickly for anyone to react. Her expensive gear scattered as she fell, with her custom-made ice axe clattering against the crevasse walls during her descent. The climber who witnessed the fall later described hearing her voice echoing from deep within the ice before it gradually faded to silence. The narrow crevasse walls pressed against her body as she became wedged in the confined space. Her breathing became increasingly labored as the tight confines restricted her chest movement. The weight of her heavy pack, loaded with luxury items she had insisted on bringing, pushed her deeper into the narrowing gap. Ice crystals formed on her breath in the frigid air as she struggled against the unforgiving walls that held her trapped. She fell approximately 80 feet into a crevasse that was 4 feet wide at the top and narrowed to 18 inches at the bottom. Her headlamp illuminated blue ice walls as she became wedged between them. The climber directly behind her witnessed the fall and immediately radioed for help. Magnolia was conscious initially, but trapped in a position that restricted breathing. The narrow confines and her heavy pack made extraction impossible with available equipment. The witness radioed at base camp at 6:47 a.m. using expedition communication equipment. A rescue team was assembled, but required specialized crevasse rescue gear to be transported up from base camp. The technical rescue took 4 hours to organize due to the location's difficulty and the need for additional anchoring equipment. By the time rescuers reached the crevasse, there was no response to their calls. Magnolia's body was recovered 6 hours after the fall. The medical examiner's report listed cause of death as asphyxiation due to positional compression in a confined space. Contributing factors included failure to follow established safety protocols and attempting to bypass designated climbing routes. The incident was briefly mentioned in climbing publications as a reminder about rope discipline. It was April 28, 2016. Weather forecasts showed promising patterns for mid-May summit attempts on Mount Everest. Expedition teams were pushing through acclimatization rotations. Claudia Kensington was 48, a pharmaceutical sales director from Boston who managed a large team. She was known for demanding management and refusing excuses. She'd hired an expensive expedition company for premium service. From the beginning, she treated guides and staff as service employees rather than expert advisors. The trek to base camp showed Everest wouldn't respond to her usual approach. She struggled with altitude, arriving with a persistent headache and shortness of breath lasting 3 days. The expedition doctor recommended extra rest. Claudia refused, stating she had business obligations in 6 weeks. She brought a satellite phone and spent hours daily on conference calls from 17,600 feet. During the first acclimatization rotation, Claudia's oxygen saturation levels were consistently lower than others. At Camp 2, at 21,000 feet, her saturation was 65%, while others registered 70 to 75%. The guide recommended a slower schedule. She dismissed the concern, stating she'd completed the rotation and felt fine. The second rotation began April 28th. The plan was to climb to Camp 2, spend one night, continue to Camp 3 at 23,500 feet briefly, then descend. Claudia reached Camp 2 with oxygen saturation at 64%. She complained of headache and nausea. The doctor noted her breathing seemed labored, but lungs sounded clear. That evening, Claudia spent 2 hours on a conference call, her raised voice audible to others. She appeared agitated and had difficulty sleeping. The next morning, she reported poor sleep and headache, but insisted she was ready. The climb from Camp 2 to Camp 3 ascends the Lhotse face at 45 degrees or steeper, taking 4 to 6 hours. Claudia struggled from the beginning. Her pace was slow with frequent rest stops. She reached Camp 3 at 2 p.m. after 7 hours, exhausted and breathing heavily. Her oxygen saturation was 58%. The guide noticed her breathing seemed more labored than expected. Claudia admitted feeling extremely tired and short of breath. The guide decided to descend immediately. Claudia protested, saying she needed rest first. After discussion, she agreed. Descent began at 2:30 p.m. Within 15 minutes, Claudia was in serious trouble. Her coordination was poor and she moved extremely slowly. At approximately 23,000 feet, she began coughing. The cough was wet. Pink frothy sputum appeared on her glove. The guide recognized high-altitude pulmonary edema, HAPE. Fluid was accumulating in Claudia's lungs. HAPE requires immediate descent and can progress to death within hours. The guide radioed an emergency call. Over the next hour, Claudia's condition deteriorated rapidly. Her coughing became more frequent with pink, frothy fluid. Her breathing became increasingly labored, rapid, shallow breaths. Her lips and fingernails took on a bluish tint. Her oxygen saturation was 48%, critically low. The guide and 2 staff who'd climbed to assist essentially dragged Claudia down the Lhotse face. She could barely move. By 6 p.m., they'd only reached 22,000 feet. Claudia's consciousness was declining. She seemed confused and couldn't follow instructions. At approximately 21,500 feet, Claudia collapsed onto her hands and knees, coughing violently, bringing up large amounts of fluid. Then she slumped onto her side. The guide checked her breathing, rapid and gurgling. Her oxygen saturation was unmeasurable. He administered supplemental oxygen at maximum, 4 liters per minute. Her saturation came up to 52%, but she remained semi-conscious and unable to move. If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The guide radioed for helicopter evacuation, but helicopters couldn't operate at 21,500 feet as darkness fell. The team continued dragging Claudia. By 7:30 p.m., they reached Camp 2 at 21,000 feet. A helicopter attempted to reach them, but couldn't land safely. The pilot radioed he would try at first light. Claudia was placed in a tent with continuous oxygen. The doctor monitored her through the night. Her condition remained critical, semi-conscious, breathing rapidly, coughing up fluid. Her saturation remained in the low 50s despite maximum oxygen. At approximately 3 a.m. on April 30th, Claudia's breathing became more irregular. Several rapid breaths, then stopping for 10 to 15 seconds, then gasping. This pattern indicated her brain was being affected by severe oxygen deprivation. At 3:47 a.m., she stopped breathing entirely. The doctor attempted CPR, but knew it was futile at 21,000 feet. After 15 minutes, he stopped. Claudia Kensington was dead. The helicopter evacuation proceeded at dawn as body recovery. Claudia's body was flown to lower altitude, then returned to Boston. The official cause of death was high-altitude pulmonary edema, with contributing factors of inadequate acclimatization, continued ascent despite symptoms, and delayed descent. It was September 8, 2017, on the lower expedition zones of Mount Everest, where rocky ridgelines meet glacial wind currents descending from higher camps. The area was covered by thin cloud layers, reducing long-distance visibility across the mountain face. Melted snow runoff occasionally formed small, icy channels along exposed rock surfaces. 30 Takaysen was 26, a wilderness photographer who had recently joined a commercial Everest expedition seeking extreme environment subject material. He had limited high-altitude experience and treated mountain photography as a technical optimization challenge rather than a long-term endurance activity. Although he carried professional telephoto equipment, Takaysen frequently attempted closer approaches to natural subjects to capture more dramatic imagery. The lower Everest climbing corridor consists of exposed granite and ice transitions where strong winds move continuously along the mountain slope. September conditions can shift rapidly as monsoon remnants interact with high-altitude air currents. At these elevations, oxygen concentration is significantly reduced, and prolonged movement pauses can lead to rapid exhaustion. Expedition safety teams had issued multiple warnings about maintaining distance from unstable ice zones and steep cliff edges. Other climbers reported Takaysen preferred closer vantage positions for photography. He carried standard safety gear, but often moved independently from group formation, believing equipment quality and physical confidence were sufficient protection. By mid-morning, Takaysen observed a small group of climbers resting near a rock formation overlooking a glacial drainage channel. Instead of maintaining standard observation distance, he approached closer for photographic framing. Although his telephoto lens could have captured detailed images from afar, he preferred closer composition for visual impact. The terrain near the drainage slope was coated with thin, frozen moisture layers formed by wind-driven ice deposition. These surfaces can become extremely slippery under foot pressure. Takaysen moved closer to the edge of a rock platform approximately 40 feet above a descending ice channel. While adjusting camera settings, his boot lost traction on the frost-coated granite. The first slip was minor, allowing him to brace using his hands, but his body posture had already shifted into a dangerous forward tilt toward the slope edge. Instead of retreating carefully, he attempted to reposition himself for what he believed was better photographic alignment. The continuous downward slope of the glacier-coated granite offered almost no braking friction once momentum increased. Takaysen attempted to use his hands and boots to slow the slide by pressing against the icy surface, but the frost layer behaved like a solid, polished plane. High-altitude oxygen reduction likely impaired reaction speed, making controlled self-arrest movements difficult under the rapid acceleration. Wind exposure further destabilized body control during the descent. The second movement caused complete loss of balance. Takaysen began sliding down the ice-polished rock surface. Acceleration increased as slope angle steepened, and friction resistance decreased. During the uncontrolled descent, he struck several protruding rock edges that likely caused deep internal injuries and skeletal trauma. The slide ended when he fell from a lower rock ledge onto a sloped ice field below. Impact force was estimated to be high due to combined gravitational acceleration and slope transition velocity. The fall caused severe chest trauma and multiple fractures, leaving him unable to move. Nearby climbers witnessed the fall and transmitted emergency distress signals once communication devices functioned under signal stability. However, strong mountain winds and low cloud cover prevented helicopter evacuation. Rescue teams were delayed until weather conditions improved. Takaysen was found several hours later by expedition medical staff, unconscious on the ice slope. Medical evaluation determined cause of death as severe traumatic injury combined with high-altitude hypoxia and exposure-related physiological collapse. His camera equipment was recovered, including images documenting his progressive movement closer to the hazardous slope zone. Expedition records later used the case as a safety example of route discipline failure and risk misjudgment above the mid-expedition camps of Mount Everest. The incident was included in mountain safety documentation, emphasizing that in extreme altitude environments, technical skill, environmental awareness, and restraint are equally critical survival factors. If you haven't subscribed yet, consider joining us as we continue exploring real mountain tragedies and the dangerous psychology of ego-driven climbing decisions. It was May 8th, 2016. Camp 2 sat at 21,000 feet in the western CUWM, a vast glacial valley between the towering walls of Everest's southwest face and the Nups Ridge. The afternoon sun turned the CWM into a furnace, with temperatures reaching 80 degrees Fahrenheit, despite the altitude, while climbers prepared for their next acclimatization rotation. Sharon Hullbrook was 42 years old, a senior vice president at a pharmaceutical company in Boston, who had built her career on efficiency metrics and process optimization. She had completed Kilimanjaro and Aconcagua faster than standard itineraries by eliminating rest days, reinforcing her belief that most limitations were failures of planning. She arrived with a modified 38-day timeline, nearly 40% faster than standard, and immediately demanded the expedition leader review her plan. When he declined, she suggested he was inflexible and resistant to innovation. At 21,000 feet, the air contains roughly 50% of the oxygen available at sea level. Acclimatization requires the body to produce additional red blood cells over weeks of gradual exposure. Cerebral edema occurs when fluid accumulates in brain tissue due to inadequate acclimatization, causing swelling, confusion, loss of coordination, and death if not treated with immediate descent. During the initial briefing, the lead guide outlined the acclimatization schedule: 3 rotations with rest days between each, followed by a summit push. Sharon immediately interrupted with her spreadsheet, which eliminated several rest days. The guide explained the schedule was based on decades of high-altitude physiology research. Sharon argued her fitness proved she acclimatized faster than average, and that the standard timeline was designed for out-of-shape clients. She made repeated comments over the following days about the expedition company's outdated methods. After the first rotation, Sharon spent her mandatory rest day working on her laptop and taking business calls. When reminded that rest days were for actual rest, she stated she knew her body's needs better than any one-size-fits-all schedule. During the second rotation to Camp 2, she deliberately pushed ahead of the group, arriving nearly 2 hours early, then spent the afternoon working rather than resting. That evening she complained of a mild headache, but declined altitude medication, stating she had experienced the same on Aconcagua and had always resolved. The next morning, climbers noticed she seemed slightly uncoordinated at breakfast. The guide noted her oxygen saturation was lower than expected. Sharon insisted on continuing, stating she hadn't come this far to turn around over minor numbers. The climb to Camp 3 follows the Lhotse face, a steep wall of glacial ice rising nearly 2,500 feet at angles approaching 50 degrees. Sharon started strong, but after 2 hours her pace slowed and her movements became less fluid. At approximately 23,000 feet, she stopped and reported a severe headache and nausea. The guide decided to descend immediately. Sharon accused him of being overly cautious and argued they were nearly at Camp 3. He explained continuing upward could be fatal. She reluctantly agreed, but complained bitterly about wasted time. Her coordination had deteriorated significantly during the descent. After dropping roughly 500 feet over 45 minutes, she stopped again, reporting her headache had intensified and she was having difficulty thinking clearly. The guide recognized cerebral edema and radioed for emergency oxygen from Camp 2. Sharon's condition deteriorated rapidly. She became confused about which direction was down and could no longer operate her descender, requiring the guide to physically manage her descent. Her speech became slurred and nonsensical. At approximately 22,700 feet, she became completely unresponsive. The guide from Camp 2 arrived with oxygen 20 minutes later. There was no improvement. 2 Sherpas arrived with a rescue sled and began lowering Sharon down the Lhotse face, a descent that took nearly 4 hours. She remained unconscious, her breathing increasingly labored, despite supplemental oxygen. They reached Camp 2 at 7:30 p.m. The expedition doctor found Sharon unresponsive, with fixed, dilated pupils and irregular breathing, indicating severe cerebral edema with likely brain herniation. Her breathing stopped at 8:15 p.m. Resuscitation efforts continued for 30 minutes without success. Sharon's body was recovered the following morning and airlifted to Kathmandu. The post-mortem confirmed high-altitude cerebral edema. Brain tissue had herniated through the foramen magnum, compressing the brainstem beyond survival. Her red blood cell count indicated a fraction of the acclimatization her altitude demanded. The expedition's incident report documented repeated non-compliance with protocol and refusal of medical intervention at multiple points, with no negligence attributed to guides or staff. It was May 19, 2014. Mount Everest rose to 29,032 feet on the border between Nepal and Tibet, the highest peak on Earth. Camp 4 sat at 26,000 feet in the death zone, where climbers made their final preparations before summit attempts during narrow weather windows. Lorraine Vasquez was 45 years old, a dental hygienist from Portland, Oregon. She had paid significant money for a commercial expedition package with a well-known guiding company. Her climbing experience was limited to guided trips on lower altitude peaks. She had trained for over a year, but had never spent extended time above 20,000 feet. She viewed the expedition as a once-in-a-lifetime achievement and had made the expedition a central part of her identity for the past year. Everest's summit push from the South Col required climbers to ascend over 3,000 feet through the death zone, where the human body deteriorates rapidly due to oxygen deprivation. The standard protocol involved leaving Camp 4 around midnight to reach the summit by mid-morning and descend before afternoon weather deteriorated. Turnaround times were strictly enforced regardless of summit success. Climbers who stayed too long at altitude risked exhaustion, disorientation, and being caught descending in darkness. The descent was statistically more dangerous than the ascent, requiring full concentration and remaining in energy reserves. The expedition leader conducted a briefing at Camp 4 the evening before the summit push. He emphasized the turnaround time of 1 p.m., regardless of position on the mountain. Lorraine made a dismissive comment about having come too far to turn back early, and that she hadn't paid this much money to follow arbitrary time limits. Lorraine reached the summit at 12:45 p.m., 15 minutes before the turnaround time. The guide said they needed to begin descending. Lorraine pulled out her phone and camera. She began taking photos and videos. The guide reminded her of the turnaround time. Lorraine said she needed more time after everything she had been through. The guide explained they needed to leave immediately to descend safely before dark, Lorraine argued that 15 minutes wouldn't matter. She continued taking photos from different angles. Other climbers from different expeditions were also on the summit, creating congestion. The guide's voice became firm as he stated they were leaving now. Lorraine responded that she had paid for this experience and deserved time to enjoy it. She mentioned the money she had invested and said she would leave negative reviews if she was rushed. By the time Lorraine agreed to descend, over half an hour had passed. The guide was visibly concerned as they began the descent. The route down was slow due to other climbers. By the time they reached the south summit, Lorraine's pace had slowed noticeably. The guide stayed close to her, monitoring her condition. As they descended further, Lorraine began stopping more frequently. Her movements became sluggish. The guide asked if she was okay. She said she was just tired. By late afternoon, they were still well above safe elevation. Daylight was fading. The guide radioed for additional support. Lorraine sat down on the snow and said she needed to rest. The guide tried to get her moving, explaining that stopping in the death zone was dangerous. Lorraine's responses became slower and less coherent. She was showing signs of severe exhaustion and altitude effects. The guide attempted to help her stand, but she couldn't maintain her balance. Her oxygen supply was running low. The guide shared his oxygen with her, but his own supply was also limited. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped further. Another guide from a different expedition reached their position and assisted. They tried to move Lorraine downward, but she could no longer coordinate her movements. She slumped against the slope. Her breathing became shallow. The guides continued efforts to revive her and move her, but she became unresponsive. Despite continued rescue efforts through the night, she did not regain consciousness. Her body was found the next morning by a descending team, located on the route above the balcony, where she had collapsed. The medical examiner determined that death resulted from exhaustion, an exposure in the death zone, complicated by altitude effects and oxygen depletion. The extended time at extreme altitude, combined with the physical demands of the climb and descent, had depleted her body's reserves. The delay in beginning the descent had left insufficient time and energy to reach safety before darkness and extreme cold set in. Evidence, including radio communications and witness statements, established that she had exceeded the turnaround time and spent excessive time on the summit despite warnings. The death was ruled accidental. Don't miss the next episode. Subscribe now to see what happens when Karens face nature's ultimate reality check. It was April 28th, 2015. Camp 2 perched precariously on a rocky ledge at 21,300 feet, where every drop of water was precious and fuel supplies meant the difference between survival and death. The extreme altitude and harsh conditions made resource management critical for survival in this unforgiving environment. Evangelene Worthington Blake was 38. A corporate compliance officer from Massachusetts whose career centered on identifying contamination risks and enforcing cleanliness standards. She approached every situation with checklists and protocols, believing that proper procedures could eliminate any risk. Her outdoor experience consisted of day hikes in New England and 2 weekend camping trips, but she had never used mountaineering equipment or slept above 3,000 feet. She viewed Everest as the ultimate test of her systematic approach to risk management and had researched every possible contamination scenario. High-altitude camping requires careful resource management, as every supply must be carried up from lower elevations at great physical cost. Fuel for melting snow becomes critically important as natural water sources disappear above base camp elevations. The extreme cold and dry air create additional challenges for maintaining proper nutrition and hydration levels. Shared facilities and communal cooking arrangements become essential for conserving precious resources in the harsh mountain environment. Evangelene questioned the sanitation procedures for shared cooking equipment and demanded written protocols for every cleaning procedure. She requested that communal areas be cleaned with disinfectant before each use and insisted on inspecting other climbers' personal hygiene practices. She hoarded extra oxygen canisters and fuel supplies, arguing she needed backup supplies for safety reasons that others didn't understand. She refused to share cooking duties, stating that others didn't meet her cleanliness standards, and demanded that meal preparation be done separately from the group kitchen area. When other climbers used the communal water station, she complained they weren't washing their hands frequently enough and posed contamination risk to the entire expedition. On the morning of April 30th, Evangelene's personal fuel supply ran critically low after 2 days of solo snow melting. She had been consuming approximately 2 liters of water daily, well below the recommended amount. At 11:30 a.m., she approached the communal water station but refused to use it after observing other climbers handling the equipment. Her attempts to maintain sterile conditions became increasingly desperate as her water supply dwindled. She spent precious time wiping down equipment with sanitizing wipes that froze solid in the extreme cold, making them useless. Other climbers watched as she repeatedly cleaned the same surfaces, obsessing over imaginary contamination, while her dehydration worsened. Her movements became more erratic as she searched through her supplies for alternative purification methods. The irony of her situation became apparent to observers as she chose potential death over using shared equipment. Her hoarded fuel supplies sat unused in her tent while she rationed her remaining water to dangerous levels. Fellow climbers offered to help melt snow using their equipment, but she refused each offer, claiming their methods didn't meet her safety standards. Her voice became increasingly hoarse as dehydration affected her ability to speak clearly. She attempted to melt snow using her remaining fuel, but the canister was nearly empty. The melting process yielded less than 500 milliliters of water. By 2 p.m., she was showing signs of severe dehydration, dizziness, confusion, and dark urine. She became increasingly irrational, accusing other climbers of contaminating her supplies. At 4:15 p.m., she collapsed outside her tent. Other climbers found her unconscious with a weak pulse and extremely dry mucous membranes. Emergency rehydration was immediately initiated by a climber with medical training using expedition medical supplies. Radio contact was established with Base Camp Medical at 4:20 p.m. Due to her condition and the camp's elevation, helicopter evacuation was impossible. The medical team attempted aggressive rehydration, but her kidneys had already begun shutting down from prolonged dehydration. Evangelene died at 11:45 p.m. on April 30th. The expedition doctor's report listed cause of death as acute renal failure, secondary to severe dehydration. Contributing factors included refusal to utilize available water sources and inadequate fluid intake over 72 hours. Her unused hoarded supplies were redistributed to other climbers. It was April 18, 2013. The spring climbing season on Mount Everest was just beginning. The Khumbu Icefall had been equipped with fixed ropes and aluminum ladders. For climbers, the icefall represented the first major hazard, where avalanches, collapsing ice towers, and hidden crevasses could kill without warning. Bethany Prescott was 44 from Greenwich, Connecticut. She belonged to an exclusive country club where competition was constant. The previous year, a woman from her social circle had climbed Everest and given a presentation at the club. Bethany decided she would climb Everest as well, hiring a less expensive expedition company. She'd done minimal physical training, reasoning that she attended Pilates 3 times per week. She told friends she wanted to give her own presentation at the club the following year. During the trek to base camp, Bethany complained constantly. At base camp, her lack of preparation became obvious. Altitude affected her more severely than other clients. She spent 3 days with a severe headache and nausea. The expedition doctor recommended an extra acclimatization day. Bethany refused, stating she was on a schedule. The first acclimatization rotation was scheduled for April 18th. Climb through the Khumbu Icefall to Camp 1 at 19,500 feet. Spend 1 night, then descend. The Khumbu Icefall is a river of ice, moving several feet per day. This movement causes ice to fracture constantly, creating ice blocks the size of houses, deep crevasses, and unstable towers called seracs that can collapse without warning. Climbers cross using fixed ropes and ladders, typically starting around 2 or 3 a.m. when ice is most stable. As the sun warms the icefall becomes progressively more dangerous. By mid-morning, collapse risk increases dramatically. Experienced climbers aim to be through by 8 or 9 a.m. The expedition leader briefed the team the evening before. They would wake at 1:30 a.m. and begin climbing at 2:30 a.m. Bethany objected immediately, stating 1:30 a.m. was unreasonable. The leader explained this was standard protocol and non-negotiable. After 20 minutes, Bethany reluctantly agreed. At 1:30 a.m. on April 18th, the team began waking. Bethany had not gotten up. At 2 a.m., the leader found her still in her sleeping bag. The leader explained the group stayed together for safety. Bethany argued she would climb on her own schedule. The leader compromised. Bethany could depart at 4 a.m. with an assistant guide. The main group departed at 2:30 a.m. and reached Camp 1 by 7 a.m. Bethany and her assistant departed at 4 a.m. The crossing was slow. By 7 a.m., they were roughly halfway. The sun was up and temperature was rising. The assistant became increasingly concerned. They were entering the dangerous period. He urged Bethany to move faster. By 8:30 a.m., they were approximately 2/3 through. Temperature had risen above freezing. The icefall was audibly active, constant creaking and groaning. Small chunks were falling from seracs. At approximately 9 a.m., they were beneath a massive ice serac, a tower roughly 60 feet tall and 40 feet wide, leaning at an angle. The serac was marked with warning flags. Standard protocol was to move through quickly. The assistant told Bethany they needed to move through quickly without stopping. Bethany stated she needed to rest first. The guide explained firmly they could not rest here. Bethany sat down and said she needed 5 minutes. The guide told Bethany that if she didn't start moving in 60 seconds, he would descend without her. The guide started counting down. At 30 seconds, Bethany stood up, angry, and started moving. They were approximately 50 feet past the serac, with perhaps another 100 feet before clear, when the serac collapsed. There was no warning. Roughly 1,000 tons of ice fell and impacted the route. The assistant, ahead on the rope, heard the collapse and dove forward. He was hit by smaller chunks, knocked down and partially buried, but survived with injuries. Bethany was directly in the path of the main mass. She had no time to react. The ice hit her with tremendous force, killing her instantly. Her body was buried under several tons of ice blocks. The assistant freed himself and radioed for help. The rescue team reached the site within 90 minutes. The recovery operation took 2 full days. Bethany's body was located approximately 15 feet below the surface, crushed by the ice. Death had been instantaneous from massive trauma. The official investigation determined the serac collapse was a natural event that could not have been predicted with certainty. However, the investigation noted Bethany and her guide had been in the icefall during the dangerous late morning period when ice is most unstable, and that Bethany had delayed in a high-risk area despite warnings. It was August the 22nd, 2015, on the upper slopes of Mount Everest, where dense mist and wind-blown snow covered exposed rock paths. A small cascade near the route kept granite surfaces slick with moisture and algae growth, and warning signs reminded climbers to stay away from unstable wet rock zones. Saijon Reeves was 28. A software engineer who treated outdoor hiking as an optimization challenge, often preferring personal shortcuts in navigation. Although he had completed several moderate urban mountain hikes, he lacked technical alpine climbing experience. He joined a commercial Everest expedition, viewing the climb as a quick physical achievement rather than a long endurance challenge in extreme mountain environments. The lower Everest slope where the incident occurred was shaped by glacial erosion, forming a canyon-like terrain with meltwater streams flowing through steep rock walls. Constant mist from ice runoff kept nearby granite surfaces wet and extremely cold. The thin air, strong winds, and moisture-covered rock created conditions where prolonged stopping or slow movement significantly increased exposure risk. Reeves observed climbers using the rope-supported trail system. Guides and Sherpa staff had repeatedly warned against crossing exposed wet granite zones. However, he considered the marked route unnecessarily indirect and chose a straighter path across rock slabs closer to the canyon wall, viewing safety guidance as overly cautious. His decision reflected strong confidence in personal judgment over environmental hazard warnings. By mid-afternoon, Reeves left the designated climbing line despite warnings from nearby climbers. He stepped onto moisture-covered granite near the glacier runoff channel, where rougher rock texture initially provided limited traction. As he moved forward, his pace increased and confidence grew, but the nearly invisible ice and mineral film reduced friction to levels similar to frozen surfaces. While crossing a smoother rock platform about 40 feet above the canyon stream, his boots suddenly lost grip. The first slip was minor, allowing him to stabilize with his hands, but his body was already leaning dangerously forward. Instead of retreating carefully, he attempted to continue toward what he believed was more stable footing. The second movement caused complete loss of balance, and he began sliding down the granite slope. Acceleration increased as the incline steepened, and the polished rock offered almost no resistance. During the uncontrolled descent, he struck several rock protrusions that likely caused internal injuries and deep lacerations before the slide continued toward the canyon basin. The slide ended when he launched from a lower rock ledge into a turbulent meltwater pool fed by glacier runoff channels. Impact velocity was estimated near highway-level sprint speed. Upon entering the water, strong hydraulic currents immediately pulled him downward and forced him against submerged rock structures. The recirculating circulation pattern beneath the waterfall created a repeated downward suction motion that trapped and disoriented submerged bodies. 3 climbers witnessed the fall and reported the incident through expedition communication channels. Rescue teams were dispatched but faced severe terrain access difficulty and high-altitude weather instability. Swift water and technical climbing equipment were required, delaying physical arrival at the site. Visual search inside the hydraulic turbulence zone was not possible during the initial response period. Reeves's body was recovered several days later downstream, lodged against submerged rocks beneath the canyon waterfall drainage zone. Medical examination determined the cause of death as drowning with contributing blunt force trauma and hypothermia. A wearable camera attached to his equipment recorded the entire sequence of movement, fall progression, and route deviation. The case was later included in Expedition Safety Education Archives as a preventable exposure, fatality associated with overconfidence in route selection and failure to maintain marked trail discipline in high-altitude waterfall canyon terrain. It was May 19, 2018. Camp 3 sat at 23,500 feet on the Lhotse face, a collection of small tents anchored to platforms carved into steep ice. The wind had died to a whisper, and the afternoon sun beat down with surprising intensity despite the altitude and cold. Rachel Dunmore was 31 years old, a competitive triathlete from San Diego who had completed 3 Ironman races and numerous shorter events. She approached Everest as an endurance challenge, similar to triathlon, spending 8 months on cardiovascular training at maximum effort. She had climbed Rainier and Denali in the 2 years prior, maintaining her normal training schedule both times and performing well. She arrived in peak physical condition with a resting heart rate in the low 40s and openly criticized other climbers who followed rest protocols, stating altitude problems were due to poor fitness and that people used altitude as an excuse for being out of shape. At altitudes above 20,000 feet, the human body enters progressive deterioration, regardless of fitness level. Extreme oxygen deprivation forces the cardiovascular system to work at maximum capacity simply to maintain basic function. In some individuals, this causes inflammation, irregular rhythms, or sudden cardiac arrest. Physical exertion multiplies cardiovascular strain exponentially. During the trek to base camp, Rachel ran sections of trail and did bodyweight exercises at each lodging stop. At base camp, she ran to the icefall and back while others rested. The expedition leader explained that unnecessary exertion consumed energy reserves needed for the upper mountain. Rachel dismissed this, stating her body's needs were different and that standard protocols were designed for people who didn't understand proper training. She suggested the company's conservative approach was holding back stronger clients. During the first rotation to Camp 1, Rachel spent rest periods doing mobility work instead of recovering. On the mandatory rest day that followed, she completed a 4-hour training hike partway up the icefall. The expedition leader called a meeting emphasizing rest days were non-negotiable. Rachel argued the policy was too restrictive and that experienced athletes should be allowed to train as they saw fit. During the second rotation at Camp 2, she did high-intensity intervals outside her tent until visibly breathless in the cold. When another climber expressed concern, she stated they were witnessing what proper conditioning looked like. The third rotation pushed to Camp 3. Rachel climbed strongly, but spent 30 minutes outside reorganizing gear upon arrival, rather than resting. That afternoon, she lay in her tent with her heart racing above 120 beats per minute, despite lying completely still. After an hour, she sat outside, noting the elevated rate and a growing pressure in her chest. The guide checked her oxygen saturation, found it lower than expected, and listened to her heart, hearing an irregular rhythm with occasional extra beats. He told her she needed to descend to Camp 2 immediately. Rachel argued that irregular heartbeats were common at altitude, and she just needed rest, adding that she had experienced similar symptoms during intense training blocks and they always resolved on their own. The guide explained cardiac issues at this altitude could escalate to life-threatening within minutes. Rachel accused him of overreacting and suggested his lack of athletic background made him overly cautious about normal training stress. She agreed to descend but insisted on waiting an hour. The guide agreed to monitor for 30 minutes only. Not long after, the chest pressure intensified and her heart rate was over 140 lying down. They began preparing to descend, but getting her boots and harness on left her breathless, the chest pressure now painful. 2 additional guides joined them. The descent began at 4:30 p.m. After roughly 300 feet over half an hour, Rachel stopped, reporting intensified chest pain and extreme weakness. Her face was pale and her breathing rapid. She became confused and disoriented, then unresponsive. She slumped forward, unconscious, and within seconds her heart stopped entirely. The guides began CPR while holding position on the steep ice face. Additional support arrived from Camp 2 within 20 minutes, but nearly an hour of continuous resuscitation produced no response. Her body was lowered down the Lhotse face after dark, reaching Camp 2 well into the night. The expedition doctor confirmed cardiac arrest caused by fatal rhythm disturbance at extreme altitude. Her heart had been under severe cumulative stress from oxygen deprivation, compounded by relentless physical exertion maintained throughout the entire expedition. Her exceptional fitness had allowed her to push through early warning signs until her heart simply gave out. Among her belongings was a training log documenting high-intensity workouts every single day of the climb. Her final entry, written that morning, noted she felt strong and ready for the summit push. It was April 14th, 2015. Mount Everest rose to 29,032 feet on the border between Nepal and Tibet, the highest peak on Earth. Base camp sat at 17,600 feet, where climbers registered with expedition companies and liaison officers before attempting the summit. Denise Carmichael was 42 years old, an insurance claims adjuster from Scottsdale, Arizona. Her experience consisted of 2 guided day hikes in Sedona and 1 summit of a 10,000-foot peak in Colorado. She had paid for a budget expedition package, but believed the mandatory liaison officer registration was unnecessary bureaucracy designed to generate revenue rather than ensure safety. Everest's routes above base camp required specialized high-altitude equipment and acclimatization. The Khumbu icefall between base camp and Camp 1 was a maze of shifting ice blocks and hidden crevasses. Weather patterns shifted rapidly at extreme altitude, with temperatures well below freezing even during climbing season. Supplemental oxygen became critical above 26,000 feet. Climbers followed fixed rope routes established by climbing teams. A registration tent at base camp processed climbing permits and route assignments. Denise approached the checkpoint and asked about the route. The liaison officer explained the permit system and the requirement to register her climb with her expedition group. She argued that permits were revenue generation schemes. The officer explained that permits helped coordinate rescues and track climber locations on the mountain. Denise's voice grew louder as she insisted she had prepared thoroughly. She stated that she had paid thousands of dollars for the expedition and had a right to climb independently. Other climbers waiting in line watched the exchange. The officer repeated that climbing without proper registration violated regulations and created safety risks. Denise remained at the checkpoint, arms crossed, insisting the policy was unreasonable. After several more minutes of back and forth, she finally turned away and walked toward the tent area. The next morning, she left base camp before dawn without her assigned group. She carried a day pack that appeared too light for a proper attempt through the icefall. Another climber noticed her heading toward the Khumbu icefall alone. She moved quickly, staying away from the main route where teams were working. She followed a less traveled path through the icefall that experienced climbers avoided due to instability. Denise navigated through the ice formations for some time, gaining elevation. The route narrowed as it approached a section where ice blocks towered overhead. She had minimal equipment and no partner for safety. She began crossing a snow bridge over a crevasse. Her right foot broke through the thin snow layer. She lost balance and fell through the surface. She dropped into the crevasse, falling before wedging between ice walls and a narrow shaft. The fall had caused injuries, including a fractured leg and severe bruising to her torso. She tried to climb out, but couldn't manage the smooth ice walls with her injuries. The crevasse was only a few feet wide at her position, with no way to maneuver. She pulled out her phone, but had no signal. She had limited water and some food. No rope, no ice axe, no emergency beacon beyond her phone. The temperature inside the crevasse was well below freezing. She remained wedged in that position. Hours passed. The limited daylight that reached the crevasse faded. Temperature dropped further as darkness came. By the second day, she was shivering uncontrollably. Her movements were slow and uncoordinated from the cold and altitude. She attempted to shift position, but managed only slight movements. The extreme cold continued. She had been without adequate water. Her body was shutting down from hypothermia, shock from the injuries, dehydration, and altitude effects at nearly 19,000 feet. She lost consciousness sometime on the third day. A team working on the fixed ropes spotted the collapsed snow bridge. They investigated and found her in the crevasse. A rescue team reached her location. She had no pulse and was not breathing. The medical examiner determined that death resulted from severe hypothermia, dehydration, shock from untreated injuries, and altitude-related complications. The fractures had caused blood loss and compromised the body's ability to regulate temperature in the extreme cold. Dehydration and the thin air at that elevation had accelerated the decline. The lack of emergency equipment, adequate supplies, and communication devices meant she had no way to signal for help. The death was ruled accidental. Her expedition company reported her missing when she failed to return to base camp. It was May 19th, 2018. The Hillary Step area at 28,700 feet marked the final technical challenge before Everest's summit, where climbers moved through the death zone with only minutes of survival time without supplemental oxygen. The extreme altitude and harsh conditions made every breath a struggle and every movement a calculated risk. Aramenta Fairweatherstone was 47, a frequent complainant from an affluent suburb who maintained detailed records of every unsatisfactory service experience and regularly demanded refunds or compensation. She operated under the belief that paying premium prices guaranteed perfect outcomes and that any disappointment warranted immediate correction. Aramenta had never climbed anything higher than a local hiking trail and had no outdoor experience beyond day trips to scenic overlooks. She selected Everest specifically because it was the most expensive and prestigious climbing goal available, viewing it as the ultimate luxury adventure experience. The final approach to Everest's summit pushes climbers through the most extreme conditions on Earth, where every step requires maximum effort and minimum oxygen. The technical climbing sections demand precise movements while wearing bulky protective gear in sub-zero temperatures. Weather windows for summit attempts are measured in hours, creating intense pressure to maintain pace regardless of physical condition. The psychological stress of achieving a lifelong goal can cloud judgment at the exact moment when clear thinking becomes most critical for survival. Aramenta demanded detailed explanations for every aspect of the climbing schedule and route selection, insisting on reviewing and approving all promotional materials used by the expedition company. She complained that the base camp facilities didn't match the website descriptions and requested written guarantees about summit success rates and weather conditions. She demanded that guides provide constant updates on her progress compared to other climbers. She insisted on receiving daily reports about expedition performance metrics and threatened to leave negative reviews and demand refunds if any aspect of the experience was unsatisfactory. Her complaints focused on false advertising and unmet expectations rather than safety concerns or climbing preparation. At 7:30 a.m. on May 20th, approximately 150 feet below the summit, Aramenta began experiencing chest tightness and shortness of breath beyond normal altitude effects. She attributed the symptoms to poor expedition planning and continued climbing while complaining about false advertising. At 8:15 a.m., she reached the summit but immediately began criticizing its appearance and demanding explanations for the discrepancy with promotional photos. The summit's appearance failed to meet her expectations based on professional photographs she had seen in marketing materials. She complained loudly about the lack of clear views due to clouds and demanded to know why the expedition company hadn't guaranteed better weather conditions. Her voice became increasingly strained as she berated her guide about the summit's disappointing size and unremarkable features. Other climbers watched in disbelief as she threatened to demand a partial refund for the substandard summit experience. Her agitation and physical exertion in the extreme altitude began taking a severe toll on her cardiovascular system. The combination of her hidden heart condition, extreme altitude, and emotional stress created a perfect storm for cardiac failure. She continued her complaints even as her breathing became labored, insisting that the expedition company had misrepresented the summit experience. Her face began showing signs of oxygen deprivation, but she attributed her discomfort to anger rather than medical emergency. The extreme exertion combined with altitude stress triggered severe chest pain. She collapsed at 8:25 a.m. while posing for summit photos. Other climbers observed her clutching her chest and gasping for air. Her lips turned blue, and she lost consciousness within 2 minutes. A climber with medical training immediately began CPR, while others administered supplemental oxygen. Radio contact with Base Camp Medical was established at 8:30 a.m. Due to the extreme altitude and weather conditions, helicopter evacuation was impossible. The medical team attempted resuscitation for 45 minutes, but her heart rhythm could not be restored. Aramenta was pronounced dead at 9:10 a.m. on the summit of Mount Everest. The medical examiner's report listed cause of death as massive myocardial infarction, triggered by extreme altitude and physical stress. Contributing factors included concealment of pre-existing cardiac condition and failure to disclose relevant medical history. Investigation revealed prescription heart medication in her personal belongings that had not been reported during medical screening.